Thank you for staying with us through the break today. We're here to honor and thank our newest Life member classes for their dedication to the Institute through their 25 years of membership, as well for their generous gift to the ALI. We have a wonderful program to follow, but first, with us are the two chairs of the 1995 and the 1996 class gift committees. I'd like to welcome Rodgin Cohen of Sullivan Cromwell, the chair of the 1995 Life Member Class Committee. Raj.
Thank you, David. I am honored to be a member of the 1995 Class Gift Committee for the American Law Institute membership campaign. There has perhaps never been a time when the effective functioning of our legal system and the fulfillment of the vision and promise embodied in law have been so crucial to ensure that justice is administered equally and for all. ALI's fundamental tenet is the advancement of a system of laws that achieves the essential goals. Such a legal system cannot be static. There are always existing laws that need clarification and new laws that are required to adapt to an ever-changing world and ever-changing expectations and realizations. As members of ALI, we have a unique opportunity to share in that vital work. It seems like just the blink of an eye when this class was invited to become ALI members 25 years ago. I remember the thrill of being asked to join such an incredible group of individuals with such a demonstrated record of achievement and commitment to the law. I'm pleased to report that the 1995 class has now raised almost $120,000, 60% of our $200,000 goal. We hope that ultimately all members of our class will be able to participate in such a worthy cause. Our class gift will be used to fund critical aspects of ALI's mission, including the Early Career Scholars Medal and Annual Conference and its numerous law reform projects. Before closing, I want to single out my fellow committee members for their invaluable contributions of time and resources on behalf of the campaign. I am now pleased to introduce our next speaker, William C. Hubbard, Dean of the University of South Carolina School of Law and the chair of the 1996 Class Gift Committee. Thank you.
I was honored to be asked to chair the 1996 Class Gift Committee. I am very appreciative of the committee's work, especially during such a difficult time in our history. It is encouraging, however, that even in this challenging time, the class of 1996 is 2/3 of the way to its goal of $200,000. The committee hopes that all class members will participate in helping to reach the $200,000 goal by the June 30 deadline to support ALI's important work. I am most grateful for the leadership of our committee of Cedric Chow, Lawrence Hellman, Gail Hillebrand, Andrew Koblentz, David Logan, and William Worthington. Our class gift will be used not only for our law reform work, but also to make ALI's work more accessible by providing free public access, to support the Early Career Scholars Medals, and to support our travel assistance program that allows ALI members who are outside of the private sector to attend meetings. With new challenges presenting new opportunities to strengthen our core principle of equal justice under law, ALI's mission to clarify and simplify the law and to adapt the law to the changing social needs has never been more important than it is today. As ALI members, we influence the development of the law, work with other accomplished lawyers, give back to a profession to which we are dedicated, and contribute to the improvement of society as a whole. I am now pleased to introduce the next segment of today's event, a conversation with ALI President David Levi and Ken Frazier, the chairman and chief executive officer of Merck, and a member of ALI's 1996 Life Member Class.
Welcome, ALI members. Every year at the annual meeting, we honor a new class of members who have been ALI members for 25 years. We call these life members. We have lunch and we have a program and we have a very good time together. Today, we are honoring the class of 1996. And unfortunately, we aren't going to be able to have lunch for you or for any of us, but we do have a treat, because in this class is the remarkable, formidable Ken Frazier. And he has agreed to speak with us today about his wonderful life in the law and beyond the law. And it's so great to be with you, Ken. And look at your handsome ALI tie. Thank you for doing this. It's really great.
Well, thank you, David. It's an extreme honor to be asked to do this on behalf of a class of so many distinguished practitioners, law professors, and of course, members of the bench. So I feel extremely honored, and I'll try to hold up my end.
So why don't we start at the beginning? You grew up in Philadelphia, where the ALI has its headquarters. So that's very, very appropriate. You went to Penn State, and then you went to Harvard Law School. How did all of that happen? You know, when you look back at your beginnings.
Well, I have to say that, the first thing that I think about growing up in Philadelphia, as you said, really proximate to the ALI, is that I was born in the inner city, but I was born essentially 6 months after the Brown decision. And I think the approach that the country took after Brown made a big difference in my life. Specifically, having been raised in the inner city of Philadelphia, I was very fortunate that the social engineers in Philadelphia were engaged in what they called school desegregation at the time. And so from third grade on, I was bused across the city to better schools than would have been available in my neighborhood, better schools than my older siblings were able to go to. And because I was able to be given that kind of quality, rigorous education, it closed what I call an opportunity gap that exists for many African-American kids in this country, because generally speaking, the quality of public schools is very much related to the ability of parents to afford real estate that's proximate to the quality schools. And in my case, I got exceptional opportunities to actually go to the best schools. And that, is why I'm having this conversation right now.
And you went to Penn State, and I know you've been a very loyal Penn State alum. That was a good experience, I take it.
Yes, it was a terrific experience. I went to Penn State because, frankly, they were one of the number one football teams at that time, and I was a first generation college person. And there weren't any counselors saying you should pick one school versus another. So I thought having a good football team was a good enough reason to go to a school.
I read on the internet that you sold tadpoles or something like that to make a little extra money while you were a student. Is that true?
Yeah, I was a 16-year-old freshman, and I didn't have a lot of money. And, I understood that, a lot of pet stores would actually pay for tadpoles. So I went out to surrounding streams and caught a huge amount of tadpoles, and it was actually profitable at that time.
So the beginnings of Ken Frazier, the entrepreneur, perhaps we see the budding CEO even early on. What you went to Harvard Law School? What was it that, looking back now, you think drew you to the law?
Well, again, I mentioned being born after Brown versus Board of Education. My heroes growing up were people like Thurgood Marshall, who led the Legal Defense Fund before, of course, becoming a federal judge and a Supreme Court justice. So he was a hero of mine. The other thing was that, growing up in Philadelphia, I knew about and later on had the great pleasure of being mentored by the great Bill Coleman, who was another hero of mine. And so I saw those hardy band of civil rights lawyers who brought about the Brown decision. And of course, Bill Coleman was one of the authors of that brief, along with Lou Pollack, who also was a federal judge later on, who I got to know very well in Philadelphia. Those were like my heroes. And those were the people that encouraged me to go to law school, because I felt like those people had made a big difference in our society in terms of fostering nonviolent change for the better.
I would be remiss if I didn't point out that both Bill Coleman and Lou Pollack, sadly no longer with us, were longtime members of the ALI and were very active council members of the American Law Institute.
And they were both very generous mentors to younger lawyers, as I found when I graduated from law school and began practicing in Philadelphia.
So that's, yeah. So you went back home. You went to Drinker Biddle, fine firm, and you were there for a good
Almost
long
15 years.
15 years. So you learned, you were a litigator, and you learned how to do it. As you reflect on that experience, how did it prepare you for what came next?
So I think one of the first things that I would say about the beginning of my career, and I made this comment in an earlier speech at the ALI, is when I came out of law school and went to practice at Drinker Biddle in the late 70s, the philosophy of developing a lawyer was that lawyers shouldn't immediately start in one area. And so there was an informal rotation where, I knew I wanted to be a litigator. In fact, I wanted to be a courtroom trial lawyer. But that didn't mean I didn't take assignments from the corporate group or the banking group or the estates group. And I think that conception that lawyers ought to be able to look broadly at issues was very, very much helpful to me as a young lawyer. Not to mention the fact that, again, I had the opportunity to work alongside some great lawyers. One of my senior partners, who's now departed and was a member of ALI, was a man named Henry Sawyer. His name may not strike people with a lot of familiarity, but he was the foremost establishment clause lawyer of his time. And Lemon versus Kurtzman and Abington versus Schempp, the two Supreme Court cases that had to do with prayer in public school and aid to parochial schools, those were cases that Henry took to the Supreme Court. And so working for him, and my first case that I had was actually Bill Coleman was my client. And it had to do with some documents that Bill Coleman drafted. You don't need to know the details, but the simple fact of the matter is I had to write a memo for Bill Coleman, and I researched the law. I'd gotten to what I thought was the dispositive case under Pennsylvania law, Pennsylvania Supreme Court opinion that dealt with the specific language in the conveyance in question here. And I wrote a memo to Bill Coleman, and a couple of months later, he showed up at Drinker in a conference room and began to quiz me about why I had reached the conclusion that the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania was necessarily right. And I learned from Bill Coleman at that time to think about the common law in a much more elastic way. And, of course, it was an opportunity to have a real excursion into the British common law, to the English common law that gave rise to these issues around real estate conveyance. The bottom line is that I was an apprentice for some really great lawyers. And later on in my career, when I rose to my feet in a federal courtroom to speak to a jury, I was imitating some of those really terrific lawyers that I got to see very early in my career.
Do you think there's still the same opportunity for a young lawyer? I mean, you mentioned two important aspects. One is just the time to see different practice areas and to be at least to start as a generalist, and then the other is this phenomenal mentoring that you have.
My sense of it is that, and I can't speak from direct knowledge because I left Drinker Biddle in 1992, but I have a lot of friends who practice law. My sense is that a lot of time is being spent on the business of law today. And that as a result, I think for younger lawyers coming through the system, the premium on developing expertise in a narrow area is much greater than it was back then. In those days, billable hours were important, but the quantity of hours is nothing like they are now. The billable rates are nothing like they are now. And I just think that for most young lawyers, I would just say that, I have a younger lawyer in my family. And when he sat down with me, a few years ago and told me about his practice area, I was surprised that his practice area was as limited and as narrow in scope as it is. And so, I believe that it's going to be harder for the next generation of lawyers to be the kinds of counselors that people like Bill Coleman were, because they won't be given the breadth of exposure to lawyers and areas of practice. That's one of the reasons I love the ALI. Because you can come into the ALI and you can get involved in a project that has nothing to do with anything that has to do with your practice or Merck's business or anything else. It's just looking at the law for the sake of improving the law and clarifying the law.
And you learn a lot. I know that when you were at Drinker Biddle, you began your long commitment to pro bono work, and you handled a number of death penalty cases where I think you were appointed counsel or you were working for appointed counsel. And can you speak about that?
Well, the most important thing I've ever done in my life was one of those death penalty cases where I was lead counsel, where we had a client who was coming up on his execution date in Alabama. His name was Bo Cochran, and he spent 19 years on death row for a crime that he didn't commit. And it was clear that when we were able to get discovery from a really great judge, the late Sam Pointer, that we could prove his innocence. And, we were able to get a man who spent 19 years on death row, believing that, there was, frankly, as he said to me, there was no God, because if there was a God, he wouldn't be in that situation for so long. We were able to get him to be free on federal habeas corpus. And I have to say that the moment the writ of habeas corpus issued, was, for me, without equivocation, the greatest moment of my career, including what's happened here at Merck. It was just a wonderful opportunity to see how the law could work for good in the context of the death penalty. And I will say that my co-counsel in that case, before he was as famous as he is now, was Brian Stevenson.
Yeah.
I should have paid him to work alongside him.
Well, lawyers don't often get the chance to save somebody's life the way maybe doctors do. And I'm sure that was just such an important experience for you. And you've had a continuing commitment to access to justice, and we'll talk about that as we go. Well, you had this long stint at Drinker Biddle, and then you decided to join Merck. So how did that happen?
Well, Merck was one of my clients when I was at Drinker Biddle. In fact, going back to the difference in the practice of law, at the end of my first year, the senior partners in the law firm allowed me to try a jury trial. I was just basically my early days as a second-year associate, obviously with the supervision of a partner. But that case was actually for Merck, and I was lucky enough to win a jury verdict. And that caused the general counsel of Merck to remember me and to take an interest in my career, and to, as time went on, giving me successively more complex and important matters to handle. And so I became a lawyer that was very close to Merck. I did a lot of their trial work around the country. And eventually, in the late 90s, the CEO of Merck called me into his office, and he basically said, in so many words, I'm about to leave in a few years, and I only have time to make one more person's career, and it's going to be your career. I was not inclined, I have to tell you, to go to Merck, because I love the practice of law. I love my law firm. But my wife had spent some time as a legal headhunter, and she saw what she believed the future to be. And she encouraged me strongly to take that opportunity, and I'm very grateful for her.
So you went over into the law department at Merck. I think you were
general
counsel.
counsel.
You were
general counsel of the JV, right? Not even in the company for about a year.
And then you became sort of the general counsel, the global.
Actually, not. What happened was I was general counsel of a joint venture between Merck and a Swedish company called Astra, now part of AstraZeneca, for 1 year. And then the same CEO, Roy Vagelos, who was a great CEO, called me into his office again and said he thought that I should probably not spend the years between the years leading up to when I would become general counsel in the legal department. He thought it was important, I should say another way, for me to go into the business. And I remember saying, I'd like to contribute, Dr. Vagelos, to Merck in my own discipline, meaning the law. And he rejected that idea. He said, Merck is a great company and it does a lot of important things. We alleviate human suffering around the world. and you really need to understand the business. And so for the next 6 years, I was responsible for what we call public affairs, which is public policy, government relations, communications, things of that nature, outside the legal department. And then eventually in 1999, I became the lawyer. But now I look back on 30 years in Merck, and I was just looking at it last night. I've spent less than 7 of those 30 years in the legal department.
You know, I'm starting to see a theme here. One of them is that more senior lawyers very quickly identified you as someone they wanted to help, which is really remarkable, wonderful for you, and I know you earned it. And also that you have pushed yourself and been pushed by others to develop a lot of knowledge and experience in areas that were probably outside your comfort zone.
Well, that's actually right. So let me take those two things separately. So first of all, I will say to anybody that I've been very fortunate in my career to be sponsored, not just mentored, by people who are in a position to make or break my career, both in the private practice of law and then when I came to Merck. And so, you know, as a minority lawyer, I see that as something that's unusual, and it really moved my career along, that these people really took an interest in me and believed that I could move into areas that I had no experience in. And then the second thing, as you just alluded to, is what I was talking about early on, which is if early in your career you learn that you can go into different areas and you can understand and be at some point facile in those areas, then you become less worried about the beginning of the journey where you don't know as much as the people around you. And so I guess I would say that, you know, this company is full of a lot of really, really smart people with PhDs and MDs. But I find that, you know, in the midst of a knowledge culture, so to speak, the willingness to learn actually is a pretty important piece of currency. If you're willing to broaden yourself and learn, or as I say, you know, it helps to know a lot about, it helps to know a little about a lot rather than a lot about a little, is what I often say.
It's so interesting. I think in some respects, being CEO maybe of Merck is sort of like being a university president or maybe even being a dean.
It feels
You're
that way.
you're surrounded by a lot of incredibly smart people who certainly know much more than you do about their areas. And yet, you know, you sort of have to have everybody pulling in the same direction, certain values, and choosing the direction.
Yes.
That's leadership.
You know, there's a book that was written by a Harvard scientist about 30 years ago called The Curse of Specialized Knowledge. And, you know, in a company like Merck, in order to get a drug from early discovery to approval and into the market, it requires a lot of people in a lot of different areas. The company is extremely complex and it's extremely interdependent. And so the ability to integrate across the company and to understand different cultures within the company. We talk about diversity generally in the sense of ethnic or, for example, gender diversity. But in a company like Merck, there's a huge issue across disciplines. One discipline doesn't understand the other discipline. And I think in many ways, I get paid to be a translator between different areas. And it's important that those areas work effectively together in order for us to meet society's needs.
They talk about that in medical school, I think, a lot, sort of translational knowledge, kind of
Right.
taking the theory to the bed. You know, Ken, I knew of you. You were a superstar, but I can remember that I really became aware of you during the Vioxx litigation. I was a judge, but I was chair of the Civil Rules Committee, or maybe the Standing Committee at that point. And Vioxx was one of those gigantic mass torts, class action. I don't know whether it was bet the company, but it was certainly a high stakes litigation. And you handled it from the defense side. And I'm wondering, as you look back on that, I'm sure that was sort of trial by fire, but what are your thoughts?
So let me say again, you know, I felt that I was very fortunate that, you know, particularly with respect to the MDL process, we had an excellent judge, Judge Fallon, down in Louisiana, who allowed us to try a number of cases in a fairly compressed period that allowed us to, you know, get a sense of what those cases were about and whether or not they were really capable of being defended. And I think the conventional wisdom in this industry was that you can't try complex scientific cases to juries, which I did not believe. And I don't want to be too autobiographical, but my dad had a third grade education. He was born in 1900 in the South. And so he had only 3 years of what passed for an education for a Black child in the South. And I thought that really helped me as a jury trial lawyer, because I knew, for example, that he was an extremely smart person. He just hadn't been given a formal education. And often the view was you couldn't try these complex cases to juries because the juries would not understand it and they would be prejudiced in favor of the plaintiff. We found anything but that. So we had great judge and Judge Fallon. The other reflection I have on that mass tort, because it was a sort of a universe of battle, securities litigation, the government brought certain criminal proceedings against us. There were the products cases and other cases, is that I had the opportunity to work alongside some of the best lawyers in the United States, including some members of the ALI Counsel, on both the plaintiff side and the defense side. And so I have a great deal of admiration for really great lawyers. And I was given access to those lawyers, and watching those lawyers perform their responsibilities again on both the plaintiff side and the defense side was just a marvelous opportunity. And I think we were able to get to a global resolution that made sense for both sides, because we had such effective lawyers working under such effective judicial supervision. And I just have enormous respect for a lot of those lawyers. I could call them out by name, but I won't. And we're even able to fashion sort of a unique settlement in the products liability cases that required creativity in addition to sort of everything else that good lawyers bring to the table. So I really, really loved that period. My clients didn't like it because they felt they had the sword of Damocles over their head. But as a lawyer, it was really quite extraordinary to be in the company of such effective lawyers.
You've mentioned two district judges who were and are just remarkable. I mean, one is Judge Fallon, who's still going strong and is probably the dean of the MDL bench, I'll put it that way, and Sam Pointer, who was just a brilliant judge and made huge contributions to the development of civil procedure.
As chair of the Federal Rules Committee, among other things.
That's right. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about it. You've had such experience with the federal bench. I mean, overall, it seems that you'd give a pretty high grade.
Absolutely.
Probably not a fair question to ask a
Absolutely.
CEO.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's important, I think, and we can talk about this later. In our democracy, I think we take for granted that we will have an independent and highly effective judiciary. And I know from my own experiences, we can go back to the death penalty case. It's not easy to take a case where somebody's a couple of weeks before their scheduled execution date and be able to re-examine it in the right way. And in the reflection of this mass tort situation in the MDL process, it was a highly complicated thing. So I think the idea that we take the rule of law and the independence of a strong judiciary for granted is a mistake. As a business person, it's one of those things that I think creates a stable environment for us to plan and execute our business over a long period of time. And again, I'm enormously grateful for the opportunity to appear in the federal courts under sometimes the rude gaze of firm but excellent federal judges.
Well said. I'm wondering if the MDL process, the mass action we now call it, has been something of great interest to the ALI. We had the aggregate litigation, the Principles of Aggregate Litigation project, led by some wonderful reporters. And the MDL area has taken over the civil docket of the federal courts. And it's as you point out, it's extremely complicated. These cases are very, very complicated. Do you have an overall view of whether this, there are different options for handling mass harms, and is this the right option? Do you have thoughts on that?
Well, I can only speak from my experience, which is, at one point we had 50,000 personal injury cases for Vioxx. So that's a pretty complicated series of cases. And, again, my experience with the judges making the kinds of early rulings that they had to make on evidence and other procedural matters, and then allowing us to try in a very short period of time. I think we tried probably 7, 8, 9 federal cases, bellwether cases, to get an opportunity to put a value on these. I thought it worked as well as anything could work. So I'm, no process is perfect, but I have to say, based on my experience, I would say the MDL process is a good process. Now, I'm sure there are people who are listening to me who are involved in it much more closely today than I am, who may want to point out some areas for potential improvement. But I have to say, that was one of the biggest mass torts ever, and we were able to resolve it. And I think probably a little more than 3.5 years.
Yeah, that's really remarkable when you think of the numbers and the complexity. I think you put your finger on two aspects here, which is remarkable judges and incredible lawyers,
Yes.
including you, but like the smartest people in the world, working on these cases and very diligently. So, well, you became CEO of Merck, and that's amazing. Merck is an incredible company, and here you were, a lawyer from Philadelphia, and you'd come into the company. And I'm sure there were other candidates for the position. And how did that happen?
Well, I do think, again, going back earlier to what I said, I was very fortunate that in the early part of my career, I was forced out of my comfort zone, out of the legal area and into the business. And when we settled Vioxx in 2007, the immediate thing was to move me into running the global commercial organization, which I did for about 2.5 years before becoming president and then CEO. So I'm very fortunate to have been given access to some of the leaders of this company and to learn from them. On my best day, I'm simply imitating Roy Vagelos, who was the CEO who hired me. And we talked earlier about being bused to good schools. That closed what I refer to as the opportunity gap. But there's another gap, which is the access gap. And if you're given access to the leaders of the company and you get to see them up close as an apprentice almost, it gives you the opportunity to think about this job in a different way.
That's right. You get role models. I think, for young lawyers, the opportunity to appear in court, then to see good judges and how they run a courtroom, then that young lawyer eventually becomes a judge, and they have role models in mind for how to do things. Let's talk about your time as CEO. First of all, I mean, just in general, in such a important period in your life, are there a few takeaways that you have before we get into kind of specific areas like the pandemic?
Yeah, so there are. I would say, first of all, what I've learned before I took the job, and it's been reinforced since I've been in the job, is values really matter. Leaders change, market conditions change, strategies change. What endures are the company's values. And I think as the CEO of the company, one of your chief responsibilities, in addition to allocating capital and making sure you have the right people in the right jobs and setting a strategy, is to reinforce the fundamental values of the company. We're a very large, global, complicated, interdependent company. And the only thing that keeps us together, frankly, around the world, the only thing that makes the concept of Merck exist everywhere in the world, whether people are 1,000 miles away, no matter what discipline that they're trained in, are the company's fundamental values. And our fundamental values have to do with scientific excellence, putting patients first and making sure that patients have access to these drugs, because the drugs don't work for people if they don't really have meaningful access to the drugs. It has to do with business integrity and legal compliance and those kinds of things. And then lastly, respect for people, including our people. And that has to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion, among other things. And so as the CEO, one of my main jobs is to continue, as I travel around the world and interact with people, to remind them of what brings us together as a collection of people who have very different backgrounds. And that is our values. I think the second lesson that I've learned in this job, and you have to remind yourself of that, because the stock market and the street really put a lot of pressure on companies to perform in the short term. And the second thing that I've learned, and I knew it before because, again, I got to see a great CEO perform here, is the importance of taking the long view in the decisions that you make about how to run the company, especially in a company like ours that is focused on R&D. It takes us, on average, 10 to 12 years to develop a drug. We fail all the time. 90% of the things that we originally think are good enough to invest in the clinic fail. So we have to be able to accept and in some ways celebrate failure. It's intrinsic to the nature of our business. The serendipity of science, it will confound the greatest minds. And so we just have to understand that if we're going to be a company that's going to be pushing the envelope and using cutting edge science to find medically important medicines and vaccines, we have to accept that there will be failure. And we have to take the long view, especially in terms of investing in R&D. The third thing I would say, and this gets to a broader issue beyond Merck, is that I think that many business people make the mistake of believing that there's a false choice between financial returns and societal returns. And I feel very fortunate to work in a company that has had as its fundamental values the idea that we have to meet the needs of multiple stakeholders, patients as well as shareholders, employees, as well as the communities in which we do business. And so, again, it's really important to realize that there isn't this real trade-off between financial returns and societal returns.
That's everything so well said. Could we talk about the pandemic and your approach as the leader of Merck as you saw this unfolding? Maybe you probably saw it before the rest of us, but if you can put yourself back in 12, 14 months ago, maybe even a little longer ago than that, how did you, as the leader of Merck, how did you, what was your strategy, what was your thinking, and what are your reflections?
Well, let me start by saying when you're the CEO of Merck, you actually have the second most important job in the company. The most important job in a company like Merck is the person who runs the R&D organizations, the head scientists, because at the end of the day, they make the decisions that drive our pipeline and drive our ability to contribute to the world. If there were no Merck, what the world would miss is the hope intrinsic in the R&D organization. It wouldn't miss the rest of the company. As much as I love the lawyers and the finance people and everything else, what the world really hopes for is what this industry produced pretty quickly in the context of the pandemic, which is vaccines and therapeutics that actually make a big difference. So focusing on Merck's approach to things, very early on, we saw the need for vaccines and therapeutics. On vaccines, we did not succeed as well as we had hoped to succeed. We have a long history in vaccines. We're one of the top vaccine research organizations, but we decided to employ platforms that had been used successfully inside the company, was essentially what are called replicating virus platforms. And as it turns out, those were not the right ones for this sort of single-strand DNA virus here. And there are new platforms, including mRNA, Moderna's platform, the Pfizer-BioNTech platform, which turned out to not only be faster, but actually to produce spectacular efficacy, spectacular ability to drive immune response. So for us, it was a disappointment that our R&D approaches did not work. And I will make the point that all across the industry, companies all across the industry focused on developing therapeutics and vaccines, most of which were destined to fail. But fortunately, we have these vaccines that are now being brought to market. In the US, we're likely to be able to vaccinate our whole population, assuming the population is willing in the next couple of months. So on the vaccine side, what we've decided to do is, since our own vaccines were not sufficiently immunogenic compared to the 95% sort of success rate that we've had with the early mRNA vaccines, we've decided to use our production capabilities and our scientific capabilities to work with Johnson & Johnson to help them produce more of their single-dose vaccine. And that's where we are on vaccines. We continue to develop therapeutic responses. We're very excited and hopeful about one particular therapeutic approach, which would be an oral therapeutic, which someone could take early in the disease and it would be able to reduce the viral load in the way that most antivirals work. We realize that across the world, not everybody will get a vaccine. Not everybody who can get a vaccine is willing to take a vaccine, and we can have a conversation about that. So it's important to have, in addition to vaccine, therapeutic options, and we continue to be excited about one in particular that we are in late stage testing for.
That's so good to hear, because my impression, obviously I defer to you and to others, but I have the impression that we witnessed something of a scientific miracle in the vaccine area, but we haven't seen the same miracle in the therapeutic area or in testing even.
Yes. Yeah. So we really do need good therapies, and especially therapies that can be used earlier in the disease process. When you have a viral situation like COVID-19, the earlier you can treat people, we know this for all viral diseases, the more likely you are to avoid the downstream issues that are, virus mediated disease problems, whether they're in the lungs or elsewhere in the body.
So, this has just been a year like no other that I think any of us can remember. And
Yeah. And at the same time that we were focused on COVID-19, our company makes lots of essential medicines for other conditions. It's not like cancer stopped. It's not like all the other areas that we're, involved with, HIV and other areas. And so one of the things I'm most proud of is that despite the fact that our company was hit hard by the pandemic, our ability to supply medicines to patients who needed them. We have actually a metric we call line item fill rate, which is the number of orders that we fill correctly the first time. That metric went up in the middle of the pandemic, which shows, going back to values, it really shows that our people have taken those values very seriously. And despite the disruption the employees face in their day-to-day lives, they come to work every day committed to getting these essential drugs to the patients who need them.
so how do you deal with what may or may not be a tension? I don't know quite how to describe it, between your business goals, your need to generate a return on capital, and your very sincere concern about health disparity.
It's a really important issue. I mentioned earlier that the company has as one of its core values the concept of patient access. We develop these medicines and vaccines, but they don't do any good if patients can't have access to them. And it's an issue in our country as it relates to patients' ability to pay for medicines at the pharmacy counter. It's an even bigger issue around the world. Let's go back to COVID-19. If, this is a global disease, and, we are having variants pop up all over the world. And I like to say that none of us are truly safe until all of us are safe. And so we have to vaccinate 7 billion plus people around the world, many of whom live in environments and in countries where the ability to pay for these vaccines is essentially non-existent. So, I think, to answer your question, I think that is the biggest challenge associated with being CEO of a pharmaceutical company like Merck. On the one hand, you have some people who would urge you to maximize profit, which you can't really do consistent with your values. There are other people who would say, frankly, you should maximize access and not worry about profit. And you can't do that because obviously the capital markets put a lot of money up every year for us to invest in research. We're probably, in our industry, the second highest amount of money put on research. Over 20 cents of every dollar of revenue goes back into research. So if we can't tell our shareholders that they're putting this money at risk for such long periods of time, with a return on invested capital that they find sufficient, then the capital markets will stop investing in research, and that's not good for tomorrow's patients. So I'm saying that I think we have to optimize patient access while optimizing shareholder returns, and it's a question of making sure you try to balance financial returns and societal returns. And there's no easy way to do it, but that's what I get paid for.
I think we're seeing, I don't know if it's a shift exactly, but we're certainly seeing a lot of discussion among CEOs about their role in American society. And you've begun to speak out on a variety of different issues. some of which are related to Merck's core business, some of which are probably not so tightly related, although they are part of the ecology in which we all operate. And I know you've thought a great deal about the role of a CEO in addressing social justice, social issues, political issues. What are your thoughts?
So these are really challenging issues. On the one hand, there are those who say that companies really ought to mind their own business, stick to their own knitting, and focus only on what CEOs get paid for, which in their view is maximizing profit. I don't subscribe to that point of view. I think companies have multiple stakeholders. I think those stakeholders increasingly are demanding accountability and transparency from CEOs about certain issues. I don't think it's my job to wade into every political dispute, but at the same time, I think there are certain issues that are core issues to the company's values. There's certainly issues, frankly, David, that are important to me as an individual. And, I have to decide on which issues I will use my platform to speak out. And, there are a whole series of issues that, in the last year or so that I've been asked to speak out. Once you speak out, and I think people know that as a lawyer, I have a lot of interest in some of these issues, you get asked to speak on a whole host of issues, and you can't speak on every issue, or you just dilute your ability to speak. But once in a while, an issue arises where I think you're being asked to speak out. And I would say that business does have a role in promoting our fundamental values as a society. I think business has a role as a unifier, as a stabilizer, to help the public understand and respect critical institutions like our courts and the rule of law. I think it's important for business to support broad participation in our democracy and respect for our democracy. I think we're living in a very toxic time. I think the level of division in our society is not helpful to the long-term goals of business or our society. I think government is stymied by that division. And frankly, I think business has always had a role in terms of reinventing our society and coming out of this pandemic. I think business is going to have a role in reinventing our economy, hopefully in a way that allows more equitable participation by all people in our society, as well as the growth. I'm going on a little bit, but I have to say, David, I look at our society and I worry about the sort of conflict divisions that we have in our society. And a lot of Americans right now look at the world as being one of constrained resources and constrained opportunity. The level of inequality of wealth and income in this country has led many people to believe that the game is rigged. And that's why you see such strong populism on both the left and the right side. And I just think it's not useful for business to simply, for example, go to the seat of government repeatedly to tilt society more in its favor, when we know that there's so many people in our country who are hurting. We know that, for example, forces like globalism, which have been good for business, the technological shifts that have been good for business have not been good for people. It's one thing to have interchangeable parts in a manufacturing facility, like we can do to manufacture the J&J vaccine. Human beings are not so easily interchangeable. And I think we have to really think about, as a company, as an industry, how do we actually help create a situation where the circle of opportunity and the circle of prosperity for all Americans is much wider? Because if we don't, as long as people think that there is, again, a fundamental constraint on opportunity, on resources, then one group can only gain at the expense of another group. And that tells you why you see people taking sort of positions on immigration, like we don't want to bring people in, and positions on some of these social equity positions where people feel like if one group is being advanced, then another group is necessarily being disadvantaged. And I'm an optimist, and I want to believe that in our society, we have the resources and the reason to actually meet some of our higher aims as Americans and as global citizens. I probably went on too long.
You did not go on too long, not at all. You are one of the top CEOs in America. Uh, that's clear, and you're a very influential figure. You're also one of the very few African American CEOs, and certainly at a company of the stature and size of Merck. And you've covered this a little bit, but do we have your full set of views on sort of what America should be most concerned about from your very unique perspective?
So I am one of, I think, 4 African CEOs in the Fortune 500 right now. And I think we talked about the pandemic, but one of the other things that we've been addressing and facing over the past year and a half is the issue of social justice, and particularly issue around racial inequality and inequity. Our society has so many disparities in health. In our business, we focus a lot on genetic information, but we know that the zip code is more determinative of people's health than the genetic code. And we know that there are disparities that relate to how our justice system operates, both on the civil side as well as on the criminal side. There are educational disparities. All of this leads to a situation where I think, frankly, in our country, we have to step up to the historical and ongoing issues that lead to structural barriers that face certain people, including African Americans. I'll just throw out one statistic. In this country, the average African American family has net wealth of about $4,000 versus $150,000 for the average white family. And there's a massive failure of our education to employment system, and that's one of the reasons why I have been very much involved in an effort in the last year and a half, which is called 110, where we have about 50 companies that have agreed to come together and to look at their own internal job requisitions and see which jobs are appropriate for recasting as skill-based jobs. The fact of the matter is, in the United States, 78% of African Americans don't have a 4-year degree. And so when companies require reflexively a 4-year degree for jobs that frankly don't require that so much, in 90% of jobs in most big companies require a 4-year degree, that's a structural barrier for many African Americans who don't have the access to the education system that will allow them to go right into college. So these 50 companies have agreed over the next 10 years to actually look at their own internal job requisitions and job families to ensure that they're in a situation where they can equitably hire 1 million Black Americans over the next 10 years. And the challenge is, we just have to get past some of the fundamental beliefs about these people, because people have aptitude, even though they don't have those educational credentials. And, that's one of the many things. I happen to think that the key to equality in this country really comes down to economic opportunity. There are all these studies that show for children, the single most important thing is whether their mother and father have a job. And so, business, the one thing that business can do that deals with this issue around racial disparities and leads to all the other issues I talked about in terms of law enforcement and education and health and everything else, is to actually create opportunities for people to be employed. That's what business does. It's in our wheelhouse. And if we can create that economic opportunity, particularly coming out of the pandemic, again, I think we can build a stronger and more equitable economy.
That sounds like a really interesting, important program. Ken, you're retiring in June. It's hard to believe. You seem so young to me. What lies ahead for you after June?
Well, that's a good question. I don't really know for sure. My goal is to run through the tape, as they say here at Merck, to the point where it's time for me to retire. I think I then have to pause and reflect. I know that I want to be able to do something to make a real contribution. And so the question becomes, we talked about all these big societal issues. The question is, where can one have impact? And I need to find an area where I think I can have impact. I think I'm still young enough. It may be on the legal side. I don't know exactly where it will be, but I would like to find an area where I can personally have some impact going forward.
Well, anybody would be very fortunate to have you as part of the as part of their team, if not the leader of the team. Uh, you've had, we've been so fortunate at the ALI, we've had you for 25 years since 1996, and you've been a great member and a member of our council. You've done a lot of work for the ALI. You've been very supportive and very generous. You were our speaker, our annual dinner speaker in 2013, and you talked about the opportunities for lawyers to be leaders and problem solvers, and you connected that to your service at the ALI. As you look back on these 25 years, can you reflect a bit on what the ALI has meant to you?
Well, I think that, first of all, being elected to the ALI remains one of the greatest honors of my professional life, without question. As a young lawyer, I would look up to the people who sat in the ALI, particularly those people on the council, and being in the room with such a broad array of lawyers, law professors, and judges, all of whom are at the apex of their disciplines and across such a broad range of subject matter expertise and experience, is just such a delight for me, particularly because, I really left the law for all practical purposes in terms of my day-to-day job. And so I feel so fortunate and so lucky to be exposed to that quality of people in that room. And, it goes back to what I said when I was a young lawyer and working for people like Bill Coleman and Henry Sawyer. I'm surrounded by giants in that room, and I'm not exaggerating. And for me, it's just such an honor. I think the other thing that the ALI does, and this goes back to the comment we made about our society, is, in our society, there are very few places where one can actually have civil discourse over issues that people disagree on. And I think one of the things that I've loved about the ALI is that we are able in the Institute to have that kind of civil discourse on important legal matters between people who have very different political views and very different areas of expertise. And that's so important to me. And again, seeing what happens in the room gives me hope that there's still an opportunity for people who have very fundamental different views and perspectives to come together and reason together for the betterment of our country. So that's what it means to me.
So, Ken, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for spending this time with us today. Next year, we hope we'll all be back together, and then you'll be there at the annual meeting, and we'll all be able to come up to you and congratulate you on your wonderful career, and to marvel at whatever is next for you, because I'm sure it will be marvelous. Thank you so much for your participation in the American Law Institute, and for what you've done for our country and for what you will do. Thank you.
Well, thank you, David. And let me just say that I'm extremely proud to be a member of this institute. And I want to just say congratulations to the other 25-year members who are much more deserving of this platform than I have been today. Thank you.
Thank you.